Hello, everybody. Hello, and I hope you're having a lovely Sunday afternoon here. We want to thank you all for taking time out of your Sundays to come and join us here. This event is called A Day with British Literature, and we are going to be discussing different elements of British literature, how it's viewed inside of the United Kingdom, how it's viewed in the rest of the world. And the idea is that we're doing this right now on Shakespeare's birthday, as I believe it is today. So what else do you do? What else do you give the hundreds of year old famous artist who has everything besides an extension on copyright? What else can we give him? Well, we can honour him with this here. So I'm going to take you through right now our panellists. First of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Zezeran. I am Australian. I run Comedy Estonia, so my day job or night job is to be a stand-up comedian, and we perform in Estonia, we perform all through the Baltics. So I'm here as the moderator, but also as the layperson. I went to a public school in Australia, and it was very, very public. We did not study Shakespeare in any form whatsoever, and the only time I've seen Shakespeare is that 3-hour Kenneth Branagh movie. I once saw it to impress a girl. That's the only reason that I saw Shakespeare. I thought Shakespeare was just a caveman with Parkinson's. Alright, anyone? Okay, good. So, anyway, that's the point. However, so I have a different perspective on Shakespeare, also coming from that island, that British island all the way down in the south. So, how we view things. So, going through there, what I'm going to do now is let each of our panelists introduce themselves, and they can say a few words about themselves to kick us off. So, Douglas, grab a mic and...
Did you get lucky from your 3 hours of Shakespeare?
Oh yeah, first girlfriend, it was great, yeah.
Always works. So my name is Douglas Lindsay. I'm a crime writer, been writing novels for 20 years. My main crime series is a character called Barney Thompson, and there's a film starring Robert Carlyle and Emma Thompson called The Legend of Barney Thompson, and that's the most successful thing that I've done. I don't know, I'm a lay person in terms of knowledge about Shakespeare and other literature, because I don't read anything at all, I just write novels. There's a line that in the Woody Allen movie, Midnight in Paris, that kind of sums up where Owen Wilson's character tries to give Ernest Hemingway a novel, and he says, "Will you read my novel?" And Hemingway says, "I hate it." He says, "You haven't read it yet." He says, "Well, if it's bad, I'm going to hate it because I hate bad writing, and if it's good, I'm going to hate it even more because I'm envious." So that's kind of how I feel about everybody else's books, so I don't read at all. So I'm here as the writer in residence, and I'll hand you on to Krista.
My name is Krista Kahel. I'm a translator and publisher, and I must say that although I have translated a couple of American authors, I am mostly stuck to Irish and English and also Scottish. And probably one of the most British authors I just had finished to translate was Kazuo Ishiguro, writing about Britain, of course, but also about humanity and history. And of course, altogether, I think I have translated more than 90 books, and most of them you can call British if you include the Irish, or exclude the Irish.
I'm Irish. Okay, I'm also a translator. I translate poetry, mostly Estonian poets into English, and mostly for performance, for public stage oral performance. I'm interested in the oral tradition and storytelling. I'm also teaching language and literature at Tallinn University. I see a student here who's suffered my comparative poetry analysis class. I think basically I'm someone who has spent a large part of my life staring at words. I'm fascinated by words, by language, by the power of language. And I'm as lay a reader as everyone else here. I mean, literature is about...
No one dares step up and say, "I'm an expert here."
No, bad word. Okay.
All right, lovely. And Annie?
So I'm Maini. I'm a 12th grader at Tallinn English College. I don't have the expertise or the I don't have any expertise, but I have studied British literature and American literature at school. So I suppose I'm here to give an opinion as a student.
Voice of the youth, no pressure. All young people you're speaking for today. Okay. What I want to do right now is I'm going to go through and just ask a few questions about the backgrounds of each of the people here so we can get more of an idea of who they are. Now, Krista, you've translated many books. We have to get the elephant in the room out of the way with Mr. Harry Potter. That was you. Now, as I've understood, I mean, many people know you from this, and welcome to Showbiz, honey, because you're going to do that one thing that everyone's going to know you for, and you're going to go, no, but I did all these other things. And that's how it works. And I was very surprised that I spoke to different friends of mine, and I said, oh, the lady who translated Harry Potter, and they knew who you were, which amazed me, because I thought they were really dumb people when I spoke to them. I had some dumb friends, but they knew who you were. So, the first thing I have to tell you, as a translator, this is a huge responsibility, because so many people are going to be reading your books, and as I've come to understand, it is an Estonian pastime to criticize each other's Estonian. Nitpicking, how do you respond to this? How do you deal with this? Tell us a bit about this.
First of all, I translated most of the books, actually, together with my daughter. I translated alone only the first one.
Okay.
And why did I do it? I remember that I was given, actually, the 3 first books of Harry Potter. And I had to decide whether to publish the books or not. And I started to read them, and somewhere in the middle of the second book I understood that I am extremely happy that I still have a book and a half to read. And that was also the moment when I realized that I want to translate it, because it was so playful. The language was so interesting, it was funny, and it was simply a very good story. And yes, I translated the first one, but when the first book came out in Estonian, then I think the 4th book was discovered by America, so that J.K. Rowling became a celebrity. The 4th book was actually the first one to be sold at midnight, and suddenly all the Estonians wanted to read the Estonian version of Harry Potter. So I recruited my daughter, and we had to start working very quickly, much quicker than usual. And what else can I say about Harry Potter?
Why did you recruit your daughter into this? How did you feel that helped you?
We just translated it together, so that I translated one chapter and she translated the second one, and so on.
Oh, so it was for speed, basically?
It was a speed, yes. Okay. And it was easier to do it with my daughter because our vocabularies and the way we used words, it's quite similar in one family, actually.
Okay, right.
And then we both read the whole text afterwards, and I think that actually it's not very easy to see that the books are translated by 2 different persons. And what else I discovered while translating Harry Potter? I discovered how rich is the Estonian language, because I had to give the Estonian readers the Estonian version of Harry Potter, and J.K. Rowling invented words constantly. She invented all kinds of curses and spells and the creatures, and I had to come up with the Estonian versions for all these. So I had to take some quite remote and old Estonian dictionaries and the dictionaries of dialects and try to find there different ways of express things in Estonian. And after that experience, definitely, and on the whole, my translating experience, I don't want anyone to say to me that the Estonian language is not rich enough to express anything in the world. So, thank you, J.K. Rowling and all the other authors.
Lovely, very good. Right, yes, okay, so now, Douglas, let's go to you, sir. So, you're not big on literature, but you're a crime writer. How do you get into writing if you're not into books?
Well, I'm lucky enough to be married to somebody in the Foreign Office. So we get posted to French-speaking Africa, and I didn't speak French, and I did everything in my power to not learn to speak French. So I couldn't get a job, and I posited the idea that I could become a writer and drink vodka at 10 o'clock in the morning and sit there and be artistic. And for some reason, my foolish wife, still newly in love, agreed to it, and she's stuck with me for 20 years. Poor thing.
Okay, that was 20 years ago, so you've been a writer for 20 years.
Yes, 22 years.
Right, okay. So this was, now you're doing crime. What appealed to you about crime?
Well, see, it didn't particularly appeal. The first story I came up with that got published, I had a barber shop at home in Glasgow, and this funny little barber who was really resentful of all the other barbers, and he was a peculiar little man. You could see him every time a customer walked out of the shop with a bad haircut. Even a good haircut, he'd watch it go in the mirror and he'd shake his head, and then he'd go back to cutting your hair. And he was a really boring man, and he didn't have the patter about giddles and football that all the other barbers had. And he used a great character for a book. So I wrote this book with this fellow at the centre, and he just happens to accidentally murder his colleagues. But it was a comedy. To me, it was a comedy. But in Britain, certainly, there's no comedy fiction section. There's a crime fiction section. So it's much easier to sell crime fiction. So when it got published, the publisher said, crime novel.
Right.
And that was it. I was writing crime novels. So I've just been murdering people for 20 years now, quite happily. But
in the name of humour, right?
In the name of humour, generally.
That's a very Scottish way to look at comedy. They all died.
Yeah.
They were all brutally stabbed. Typical.
It is very Scottish.
Sure.
And Shakespearean. Yes.
Okay, one more question. So you've spent 3.5 years in Estonia now.
Just coming up to 3, yes.
Okay, 3 years. Do you feel that living here has changed your writing, or has it influenced you? Tell us something about this.
I can't say it. I mean, I'm very much. I sit at the kitchen table wherever I am, and I look out the window and I write. I mean, I love living in Estonia, and I love Estonians. Mainly the fact that they never encourage you to chat. So you rarely run into a conversation in Estonia when you don't want one, which happens in other places like Scotland. So I'm quite happy to walk around. I love living here, and I love living with the sea and the people, but it hasn't really changed the way I work, because I'm very insular in the way I do. I just have my own way of working, and I just go on with it wherever I am.
Okay, very good. All right, Miriam, we're going to go over to you now. So now I see one of your passions here is poetry translation, which I think is, for me, the subject of translation is super interesting, because how much leniency or how much creative guidance or are you allowed to take, creative freedom are you allowed to take with a work? I mean, particularly poetry. I mean, there's no one. Maybe Krista here could say yes, it's this word and not this word, but poetry is so subjective. Tell us a little bit about your work translating poetry.
I'll tell you how I started in Estonia. Was when I first came to Estonia, I had Estonian language lessons with someone who was a great fan of Estonian poetry, and she gave me a volume of poetry by Doris Karava, who's one of the major poets living in Estonia, for pronunciation practice. So I was using these beautiful poems for pronunciation practice. I understood a word or two here and there, but I felt the rhythms, I could hear the sound. And then much later, I saw some translations, or Doris approached me with some translations of her poetry. And I read them in English. And I thought, but these are not the things I was reading. That rhythm, that sound, the whole essence of what poetry is and does was gone. And so I was motivated to take up translating poetry, and I looked much more at how the poem means rather than what it means. Mm-hmm. There's not a message, but how are the different elements in the poem working together lexically, semantically, acoustically, for that immediacy that you feel when you listen to a poem or read a poem.
That's really interesting for me, because through my work with Comedy Estonia, I have to tutor and be a mentor, I guess, for Estonian language stand-up comedians. And if you view stand-up as some form of poetry, let's say in a way, I've had to work with them when I don't understand Estonian very well. But I can hear the tone, I can hear the rhythm, I can hear the pacing. I heard a totally new performer the other night, never met them before. I saw them on stage and I could tell they had structure, punchlines. I knew where the setup was. I knew what the joke was, because you can hear this in the flow, and I knew, okay, that person has structure, I can work with them. So is that similar to your experiences? You don't necessarily need to understand every nuance of it, because there's poetry is about much more than the word.
Poetry is very elusive and elusive. So I think as you're reading it, you have to work much harder with poetry than with perhaps a novel, because the syntax is loose. So you're making connections, you're forced to make connections and find your way through the text. It's like a journey, you're following threads. And they don't always add up, and then you read it another time and you find new connections. The difficulty as a translator is that, well, every time you read a poem, it's another reading of the poem. It's another poem in a sense. This is the same perhaps of prose writing too. So I think for me it's a case of finding threads that bind it together rather than a meaning or a message. It has to be something that will generate meanings to the next reader.
Sure.
In the same way that the original did to the Estonian reader.
Cool. I want to come back to Krista for a moment. Maybe in a different example, but like with my stand-up comedians, we're an art form where we write and perform ourselves. So we're the writers and the performers. If we had an author who could speak both languages, why wouldn't that author translate their own work?
Of course, he or she could do it, of course.
Okay. Is there common for that, or would it still be?
It's sometimes Estonian poets have translated their own poetry into other languages, for instance, Jan Kaplinski. But on the whole, I think that still a native speaker ought to translate from the other language, because if you learn a language, your vocabulary won't ever be as big as that of the native speaker. And you also can't understand maybe all the shades of meanings and the layers of style and all these things. Only a native speaker probably can understand it.
In that case, then, is it common... Sorry, Douglas, back to you a second. That common, then, maybe even that the author might go back and be one of the reviewers of the translation, or just not? You just pass it off and that's it? Oh,
yes, I think so, yes.
Okay, that's it. Douglas, yes.
I was just going to say that sounds like an awful lot of work from a writer.
You don't want to do it now.
You've already written the book once. Once you write your next book, you don't want to write it again.
Okay, so it's easy to outsource that then.
Yeah, and then check it over, I guess, if you know the language.
Now, did I understand one of your books is being translated into Estonian? Did I?
Yes, Song of the Dead it's called, I hope.
Okay.
By Krista's company. So the book Song of the Dead is the first one I wrote when I got to Estonia, and I intended quite a lot of it to be set in Estonia, and it's written from the point of view of a Scottish detective arriving in Estonia, so it's from the first person, so I was that new here. I didn't really have to know about Estonia because it was from the perspective of somebody just turning up. I ended up taking him back to Scotland quite early in the narrative, maybe about a quarter of the way through the book.
You're like, that's it, I'm done with Estonia.
Yeah.
That's it. I've got my marketing angle, that's all I need. Okay.
That wasn't what I was thinking, but that was kind of how it worked out. I mean, I don't plan ahead when I write, and the story ended up taking me back to Scotland.
Sure. How can you, as the author of a work that will be translated, I mean, okay, you don't speak very much Estonian, so you can never truly know the quality, or not the quality, I guess, but you never really know how great that translation is. Does that concern you, or do you even think about that, or...?
I don't even think about it. I don't know that you can, particularly. Maybe if you're very involved close to the country, or that you have a lot of contacts, friends there, maybe it means more to you, but I think generally most authors in translation are just happy they're getting the check for their work to be translated.
Sure. I'll get to you, Annie, in a second. There's one more question for Krista, because I'm super interested by this. Let's say you've worked with some very famous authors, some that are still alive today. I'm trying to say not just J.K. Rowling, to get away from that. But my experience in dealing with large international stars is that they have very controlling management, they're looked after, and many creative elements of what they do. Like, for example, if I bring Jimmy Carr here, I can't just put up any random picture of Jimmy Carr. It has to be approved by his management, they have to see the image, and they want to have a say. But how does a foreign book manager judge your translation in another language when they certainly can't read it?
They can't judge it. They have to trust me. Let us say that maybe in my case, I also had always a very good editor who checked actually my text. Although the checking was also was more easy Estonian enough, not how accurate it was. I was able actually to make it quite accurate. But I have met quite a lot of the authors who I have translated. And I am very glad that they have actually trusted my translations. And as for the judgment, perhaps the Estonian audience who reads the books is able to judge actually, are they good enough? And by the way, even J.K. Rowling's translations were very well received, I must say. You were talking about criticizing the fellow Estonians. They were very well received.
Okay, lovely, good. So, just by the way, guys, in just a moment, I'm going to throw some questions out to the floor. So, if you have some questions for our panelists, have a think for a second, and you can ask them in just a moment. Now, Anni, you're here, you're in high school right now.
Yes.
And you even have some exams tomorrow.
Indeed.
What the hell are you doing here? Come on, you've got terrible parents. Come on. My apologies.
Actually, my mom is here. So.
All right, hi, Mum. Hi, Mum. Now, tell us about what's, let's say, at least English language literature you've studied in school, British and American. What have you? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so actually most schools don't have this, but our school has a British and American literature course. But other schools like sort of incorporate those books like into their English lessons as well. So in 10th grade we start with, we sort of follow a timeline. So in British literature we start with the Epic of Beowulf, which is for like a 10th grader, you think that you know the English language really well, but then you start reading it and you understand that you don't know English at all. Because there's so many sort of ancient words that you had no idea of, and it's at first it's kind of hard. But then we go on to the Canterbury Tales, King Arthur stories. We have a whole course of Shakespeare. We even had to learn To Be or Not to Be by heart. Not that I would be trusted to recite it here. Then we take a lot of poetry from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And when it comes to the 20th century, we sort of have more liberty to actually choose the books we want to read. So a teacher would give us a time frame, so let's say 1950s, and then we can actually choose a book. And I don't know, that's sort of I think that most students enjoy that bit the most.
Which book did you choose?
Brave New World.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Choosing an easy one there. Okay, just a quick page turner. Okay. Alright.
Yeah, and then we finish up with the 21st century, and we can choose books from the books either long-listed or short-listed for the Booker Prize.
And is this have you specifically, you're in the English college, sorry? Or the English college. So obviously, okay, there's going to be a emphasis on English language literature in your studies, but have you taken extra studies, do you think, or is this typical of someone at your school to have this much exposure to foreign literature?
I haven't taken any extra courses, but I think that for a common Estonian, a youngster, this isn't really common to have this much emphasis on I don't know, Beowulf or epics. But I still think that in other English lessons, they're still they're gonna be modern, mostly modern British authors. Or American ones, for that matter.
Okay, so young people, even if they're not in the English college, they are still getting exposure in high school to that. Okay.
Yeah, and sorry.
It seems unusually cruel to give you Beowulf. I mean, it's not like kids in Britain would read Beowulf and understand it.
I would never do it like that. Oh, by the way, when I said I saw that 3-hour Kenneth Branagh Hamlet, I didn't understand a word. Not one word. I was like, where are the subtitles, guys? I'm going to need to... So because that use of language, that old use of Shakespeare language, I just never been exposed to it. So I really, literally didn't understand it.
And I think that's one of the reasons that young people sort of at first don't like literature because they just like don't understand the words, or like even if you understand the words, like you just read it and you don't understand because like you either like don't have like the background information or you don't get the references. For example, when we read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and you just read it and you see the words but you understand nothing, but our teacher gave us this website that gave us all the references and what the references meant, and then when you start reading it, you actually start liking it because you know you understand it.
Okay.
So
you're saying school actually taught you something?
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. That it opened
Shocker.
your eyes. How do you think? Consumption of literature has changed now in 2017? Because I think we're in a phase of the world where the culture is changing. Our TV is going out the window. We're watching stuff online. We're watching YouTube. We're watching things in clips online. Let's say even in literature, we've got e-readers down to that level. We no longer need a physical book. Maybe that's great for young Estonian people. They can just download a book rather than having to wait for a copy to get shipped or something. Do you feel somehow consumption of literature has changed in 2017 for young people?
Yeah, for sure. I think that now, as we have so many like other opportunities to fill our time, for example, you know, watch a movie or just be on the internet, then we start like, I don't know, we don't read that much anymore, because before when you were bored you would just pick up like a book and like read it, but now as you have so many other opportunities, then you just, you know, don't really want to do that anymore. But at the same time, you mentioned e-readers. So actually we talked about this in our class, and we feel like Estonian like young people aren't that amazed by e-readers.
Okay.
So maybe we're left behind, but most like Estonian young people still feel like they want like the physical copy of a book, and some like books you don't even imagine reading on an e-reader. So I was just talking with my mom about this. So I'm reading The Godfather right now, and I wouldn't imagine reading The Godfather on an e-reader. It's just I can't tell like what it is, but it would just feel like wrong or like weird to read it on an e-reader.
And Krista, please.
I just want to add that you're not old-fashioned, you are very fashionable. And the number of physical books sold in the whole world is steadily increasing. The number of e-readers sold is decreasing. So e-readers probably have found their niche for probably articles, non-fiction, something else, and fiction is more and more read in physical books.
Right. But how is that then here in Estonia, where it's sometimes difficult to get all the books? I mean, obviously, Raamat, our fantastic sponsor, has many fine books that you may like to purchase at conservative prices. But, I mean, for me, it just seemed easier. I don't mind reading off a Kindle or an e-reader. For me, that was okay. I don't like reading off an iPad. That's too bright. But for me, it was just so much easier. I could just get the book straight away. I didn't have the shipping. Or is it now that, thanks to companies like your own and Rahvat, we can get a decent supply of books? How do you feel? Is there a good supply of books in Estonia?
Yes, more or less, but of course Kindle and e-readers are very good when you're traveling, for instance, or when you really want the book immediately. But at the same time, you can buy the physical copies of books from Amazon or some other places, or from Raamat also. You have to wait for maybe a week or a couple of days.
Okay. Interesting. All right, let's start with a few questions. Maybe someone has something. Yes, sir. I'll come over to you. It's okay.
Hello. Thank you for the really great discussion. My question is to Douglas. In terms of crime fiction, do you think that geography affects the writing or the literature, in especially crime fiction? Because I feel that it's very, very common in Scandinavia, for example, and it's a very popular genre. So, do you think it has an effect, like geography or for example, even the climate of a place? Thank you.
Well, I'm coming from the I don't read crime fiction point of view, but I think definitely there is that grimness up north, and it's definitely going to change the tone of a crime novel. And there's the Scandinavian, the Scotland, it's absolutely huge crime fiction. It's like our biggest import, that and football, obviously. And I feel that in Scotland, and I feel a connection. I think there's a connection there between Scotland and Scandinavia, and the kind of, it's just a bleak humour, and it really comes across, and it is going to be very different from something, even the south of England. It just feels, it's a very different feel to it. The south of England crime, it's a gritty, nasty, funny Scottish crime.
Miriam, how have you encountered in the works that you've been translating and working with? Have you noticed is there a dark thread through Estonian literature? Or poetry even?
There's a lot of variety in Estonian poetry. And, Doris Karava, who I'm translating, focuses very much on, yes, dark things, but looking for light. I think that with any of the genre, whether it's poetry or prose, it's still that level of art. I mean, if we take literature as one of the arts, it's an expression, it's communication between the writer and the world. And it's going out to other people. And I think this is fascinating what you were saying about the darkness or the grimness of Scottish literature, because crime fiction exists globally, as do other types of fiction. The same goes for poetry. It's a global phenomenon. And you only have a certain number of types of plot, for example. But what makes it that window on the world is that you change the location and it feels different, it smells different, it sounds different, it looks different. And that's the magic. And you can sort of identify, maybe there are parallels between Scandinavian and Scottish, but then there's maybe a shock for the Portuguese reader. And that's the beauty of the communication of
that it's so
literature.
different, that setting is so different to what a, say, a Portuguese person might.
We're still dealing with the same emotions, the same range of human emotions, the same types of things and situations that people encounter, but the difference is in actually the place and encountering and experiencing that place. So those very sensual, concrete elements that you think, well, is there a difference between a Japanese crime and a Scottish one? But then even within that, there are still differences. I'm not sure if all Scottish crimes would happen in the same way. I think there's another...
Could do in my books.
Okay.
All right, lovely. Okay, anyone else have a question for our panelists here? Brave individuals, put your hands up. That's all right. It's okay, feel free to email or tweet them in if you don't want to talk. You can smoke signal or something like that. That's all right. Now, what did I want to go back to here? Annie, how do we break down the barriers for this classic literature for young people? For me, what I became the other time I've seen Shakespeare was Leonardo DiCaprio in Romeo and Juliet. Is that a good idea? Should we be rewriting? Should we be taking old literature and applying it to a new circumstance to appeal to young people? Or should those kids just read the books? Like, is it, where's the balance in that?
Although it would be nice for Leonardo DiCaprio to reenact all the great works of British literature, I think that, as I told before, we don't need, I don't think we need to make this sort of modern versions of Hamlet. I think that's, I don't think that young people like that anymore, but I think that what young people would like is to actually understand it. So to have more background, or I think that the teachers usually think that we get the references, or we get what's going on, and we inherently sort of know what's going on, but at most times we don't, and then the teacher gets sort of I don't know, angry that we don't know, and then we get angry, and then
And then everybody hates Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly.
Fault.
Yeah, but I think that the more background you have, and the more you sort of if you have like let's say Hamlet, for example, and we take that over like a long period of time. So you know every lesson you read some, you get some background, and you sort of like get into the book, and then you have like more interest in it. But if you just like you have to read like this one book at home, and then you know you have some kind of test, and then you don't really like remember anything about it, then you know there's sort of no use.
Okay. And do you, I mean, you're going to the English college, so you specifically studied more of this, but is there an equally large curriculum for Estonian language literature as well in the schools or your experiences? Or?
Yes. I think that in our school we even like learned more English and like more British and American literature than we did like Estonian. But yeah, I think like in other schools the emphasis is still on like Estonian literature and yeah.
Okay. Krista, do you know much about what's happening with the schools and the programs, like and the balance between English and then Estonian in schools and how young people are learning this?
Not much, but I think that usually Estonian literature is actually taught more than English literature.
Sure, of course,
or other literatures. But I think that the main thing is perhaps not to explain the background. Background is also important, but for instance, when you want to get young people to understand classical works, somehow you have to break down the barrier that it's classics, that it's something terribly remote, that it is something removed from you, and perhaps try to explain to young people the age of Romeo and Juliet, for instance, that they are the same age as you in the class. They were thinking about the same things, they had the same emotions, and that these emotions that are expressed in classical works and the situations and the things that the authors wrote about, they are the same for the whole humanity, for human beings everywhere actually, and that's the reason they are classical works, not because they are something that has been just put on a kind of postament, and these are like a kind of stony statue or something like that.
Sure, we have to do it. Why? I don't know. That's a classic. We have to do it right to actually find the reasons why.
And perhaps in that sense, new and fresh takes of the classical plays are very welcome, actually.
Okay. Yep, Douglas?
I think it does actually help to have the Leo DiCaprio type people. The first thing David Tennant did after Doctor Who was Hamlet, and it was on the BBC, and it was just after his run as Doctor Who was just coming to an end, and there would have been millions of people watched Hamlet who wouldn't have watched Hamlet because it was Doctor Who doing Hamlet. Okay. And he did a great Hamlet, and he did the same interpretation that everybody else did.
Right, it's a classic interpretation at least. So there we go, there's a nice middle ground.
Yeah.
To have someone famous and well known and respected.
Yeah, and Benedict Cumberbatch has done Hamlet in the last couple of years, and a lot of people, Sherlock fans, will have come to Hamlet.
Sure. I think I went to see A Midsummer Night's Dream. Or maybe, was it? I don't know, I saw something, because it basically was Patrick Stewart.
There we go.
Was doing it. There we go. Right, because it's the same thing. So there's a way to get into that. Is that? I don't know if I'm going down the wrong path here, but is that going to happen in Estonia as well, to get more well-known actors and to get them into these older plays? Could that apply to Estonian literature as well, or do we just want to see Koi Thomas singing and that's it? Like, we don't want to see. I don't know. All right.
We did an Estonian here.
No.
No.
Miriam, I want to change the topic for a second and talk about... I have always been fascinated by Ireland as a whole, because... And when I first... Irish literature, throughout the ages, Irish culture is through many, many places, and not just the Irish pubs. Irish authors, Irish poetry, these are classics throughout the world. But Ireland has a population of 4 million people. That's less than Finland. But to me, Ireland punches above its weight in terms of cultural contribution over time. Why is that so? How did that get to that? this small island off to the side there?
It's always hard. It's a very big question, and I think there's no easy answer. I think one thing that maybe helped is that Ireland has one of the oldest vernacular literatures in Europe, in the world possibly, because the Old Irish, the oral tradition, was recorded by the Christian monks. Christianity came to Ireland, and there was this mix of the pagan and the Christian. They recorded in manuscripts this old tradition of the poets and the bards. So there was that kind of synthesis. So that gave a lot of depth to Irish literature. And at one point, then there's also a linguistic dimension, and it branches in many curious ways. You could say it's kind of piggybacking off the fact that its neighbour is England, and so there is English. But at one time, there were actually 4 languages in use in Ireland. So there was Latin, there was Irish, there was Norman French, there was English. So there's a lot of perspectives. But I think maybe what is perhaps you could add to the mix that perhaps helps it explode is, we've talked a lot about how literature is about humanity, it's human emotions, it's the same globally. People expressing that, communicating their art to others. I think any culture that has had to reflect on its identity, I mean, writers are thinking about themselves, about the world, through the people that they create in their prose. They're showing aspects of the world and views, but I think that Ireland has had a lot of conflict, a lot of incomers, sometimes friendly, sometimes dramatically unfriendly. So I think at a certain point the nation is responding to others repeatedly and in different ways. And what is more self-reflective than literature?
Right, okay.
And then you have that background that's recorded, that's there to use.
Okay. That's actually the topic that I want to get to next, that you sort of touched on, that throughout history we've got one of the behemoths of the cultural contributions to the world, for better or worse. The British Empire is right there. You're part of it, you're not part of it at different times throughout history, for better or for worse, as you say. And the British sailed all around the world, conquered a whole bunch of places, and took their culture and their language and their literature around the world. So in that way, British culture becomes so pervasive and such a part of many different other cultures. But now, the British Empire is setting, one might say. Brexit, it's downhill, they're over, right? But we have many different other countries that are taking that up. The question I'm trying to get to is British literature still as relevant today? And the follow-on question then is, how are we getting other cultures that were British and now are taking it and adapting it and making it their own? Mr. Scottish layman, I don't read, how do you feel about this?
Yes.
There's more in this, come on, there's more.
Some element has to be the spread of English language, and the amount that it's spoken is to do with America now, because American culture, sadly, is so pervasive around the world.
Okay.
And far more people are learning English from the Big Bang Theory than they are from Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. So I don't know how much British literature still plays in that around the world, but Britain is still a great, we're still a great export. Harry Potter, James Bond, Adele, the Beatles, there's just so much, Sherlock Holmes, there's so many great things there that people still talk about, and the language is all part of that, which is why it's still out there as the literature part of it. Well, I can't comment.
Okay. But that was interesting, you talked about, I mean, now the real exports that we have in 2017 are pop culture, not just...
Yeah, I think so.
Like you say, that's what America's given us, and then, because the examples you just listed, okay, J.K. Rowling literature, but the Beatles, about Adele, this is pop culture, this is now what we're consuming rather than classic stuff.
Well, it's bigger, I mean, because it's simpler, it's faster, it's easier. A 3-minute pop song is a lot easier than a 300-page novel. Okay. It spreads much quicker, much more quickly, excuse me.
Oh my God.
I got there.
Very good, very good. Krista, let's go to you. Your thoughts on the place of British literature in 2017. Does it have the big standing that it used to? What do you feel about it?
I think it still has a big standing, actually.
Okay.
It's very much alive, although from time to time there have been talks that the British novel is dead or dying or in a very bad way. But at the same time, I think one of its strengths has been to actually let itself to be enriched by people coming from other language areas. I have translated a couple of authors who have studied in other languages or talked other languages before starting to write in English. For instance, Michel Faber, who studied in Dutch and has become a Scotch writer now. His use of language is a bit different from, let us say, the ordinary English use. Then I have translated quite a lot of books by Doris Lessing, who has Africa in every book she wrote, and the passages she dedicated to Africa had an absolutely different feel to it. And she used language in a different way. Then, not exactly a British writer, but a writer using English, John Banville, who uses English in such a way as that actually it was said that even the Irish had to read his books with a dictionary. And he has taken English and he does whatever he wants with it. And there are other samples, of course, from early ages already. Joseph Conrad, for instance, who in his head probably translated from Polish into English. But all these authors have become part of English dictionary, English literature, and English literature is richer because of them. And at the moment, of course, there are a whole number of young Nigerian writers coming and writing in English, but bringing also Africa with them, Nigeria, and the different understanding of language, background, different experience. Also, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all these areas that are connected to Britain, who use, actually the authors who use English, but at the same time have their own national background, and they come from a different world and they use the language in a different way, but at the same time they are also part of the British literature at the moment. Or let us say literature written in English.
I think that's interesting because we spoke earlier and I said, well, if you have an author who can speak 2 languages, why wouldn't they just do their own book in English? And you said, okay, some people want to write in their native language to get the richness of it, but others, there's a whole group of authors who have specifically said, I know I don't speak Shakespeare's English, but I'm going to write this in English anyway to give an effect, or because some of them have very interesting uses of English that people would find fascinating.
But I think that some of these authors have grown up with English anyway. Okay. And for instance, there is a very good author who is coming in this spring actually for the Hair Literary Festival, Tan Duan Eng, who comes from Malaysia, and he's one of the straight Chinese who writes in English, and his native language is English. And he's an absolutely wonderful English speaking and writing author.
Okay. That's very fascinating. Okay, that some people, their choice of language is also very important. The choice of language they originally write in. Miriam, have you discovered that with some of the poets that you might work with? That do some of the poets you know work sometimes in English, sometimes in their native language, or are you seeing some poets that are specifically having English as a second language and then saying, hey, you know what, I speak an interesting English, I'm going to try and write some poetry in that?
I can think of one Irish poet, Kieran Carson. He's a Belfast poet, so I'm going back to Ireland now, if that's okay. His first language was actually Irish. His parents were living in Northern Ireland, and they decided that they wanted him to grow up speaking Irish. So he spoke Irish before English. And he recounts how he was lying in bed at night and he was thinking about, he could hear a horse's hoofs on the cobblestones outside. And he was thinking of the Irish word capal, and it seemed to fit. And then he encountered horse, You got, well, horse has got nothing to do with that sound. This was alien.
Copal is horse in Irish, is
Yeah.
it? Okay.
And so he's a poet who has explored, he only writes in English, but he also has this shadow of Irish lurking behind, or that is in his mind as well, which informs, and he's very playful with language. I think this focus on language and sounds, of course, is more accentuated in poetry. I also know another Irish poet who at one point had to self-translate, and he said, but actually they're not the same, because once he started to translate his own poems, because he was also a singer, a musician, he said that, well, they started to go in a different direction. And this is also something that Kieran Carson says, and many writers of any type will say, Douglas just mentioned that he didn't know where a character was going, or he started to do something else and he took him back to Scotland. You start working with the language, you may have an idea of your general direction, but specifically with poetry, you see you're grasping and articulating something that's almost beyond language, and you can't always mold it, you don't master it, and it starts to lead you somewhere. And I think this is perhaps true of literature. You're trying to give voice to something, you're finding out about it at the same time, you understand what you've written, you understand much better by the time you've finished writing, even if it's not where you intended to go or thought you were going. And it's possibly boring just to go where you think you're going anyway.
Okay, right.
Because you'll bore yourself as a writer, perhaps. Well, Douglas could comment.
Sure. Did you have a question? Did you?
Hi, thanks. Miriam, what I wanted to ask you was, that's a really interesting point, and as a translator, do you find it difficult to stick, and Krista as well, do you find it difficult to stick to the story that the author is telling, or do you bring your own thoughts and views into that, and then how does that affect it? Do you then take the poem or the story off into a different direction by accident? Do you have to rein yourself in to make sure you don't do that? Thanks.
So, shall I go first? I'll talk about poetry and you can talk about novels. I think with poetry, the guiding principle for me is that, well, with any poem, it could be translated by 20 different poets, 20 different poems, translate them all back and you won't get the original. So you'll get facets, you'll get interpretations. Some will lean more towards finding a message or a meaning. But for me, what guides me in poetry is that I don't see poetry as having a fixed meaning. It's so elusive and elusive, as I said earlier, that I'm interested in how it means. So if there's a rhyme scheme, an internal rhyme, what is it doing? It's never just there randomly. It's always reinforcing something. So sound is meaning. So you have to work with that. And there are other elements in the poem that are working together to give it a coherence. So the struggle for me is to, well, when I have a poem to translate, I'm terribly slow. I'm the slowest translator in the universe because I eat, live and sleep with the poem for days, weeks, months. I've had poems that I've been translating for 5 years and I still don't think I've got there, but at a certain point publishers say, no, cut off, we need it now, and you let it go. But there will always be more and other translations. And then value judgment comes in. People have preferences, think, no, I want something that's more obviously literal, other people want something else. So for me, a creative approach is trying to get inside it, trying to get into the mind style of the poet, as in what were they grasping at, and how can I produce a poem that's also grasping at something, not fixing it.
I thought you had a point I want to grab onto there, which was you talked about when the poem, the translation goes out there into the wild and it's consumed by its intended audience. Some people will say, oh, this is a whimsical translation that uses quite some liberties. Some people will be like, no, this is I really want it more strictly translated. Does this change your view or your translation style over time? And that constant feedback, as it turns out, let's say the Estonian audience wants it more literal than whimsical. Would you adapt that? Have you had that experience, that feedback thing?
But I think that's the very same thing that happens for the poem in the original. It goes out into the world and it's interpreted very differently by different people, depending on how much perhaps they know about the poet, the culture, or their life experience. Because ultimately reading, it's our mental construction based on those words. our experience of the world kicks in.
Sure.
And we read, so we create our own readings. And I think if that's something that the original has to tolerate, then I'm actually happy if there are very different responses to a translation. If there were different responses to the original also, then it's somehow got some kind of an equal footing.
Sure.
The Irish poet Nuala Nagonal, who's been in Estonia a few times, has actually written a beautiful poem called Pharaoh's Daughter. The language issue, sorry. And she compares her poems to she talks about the story of Moses and his sister Miriam, and how the mother of Moses created this little boat of twigs and the baby in it and set it afloat down the river. And it landed up in the lap of Pharaoh's daughter. And she said that for her, writing in Irish was something similar. You craft it with care, you love it, but you let it go and see where it lands. And I think that sort of sums up the creative endeavor, whether it's writing or translating.
Okay, sure. Krista, your experiences on the same thing, but from straight literature.
Yes, when translating prose, of course, I also have to follow the style, the mind, and the heart, and the story of the author. And they say that there is a golden rule for the translation. It has to be as close to the original as possible and as fluent in Estonian as possible. So the ideal is somewhere between these two things. It has to be very natural in Estonian, at the same time it has to be very close to the original. And that means that I'm not going to invent anything of my own. Probably in poetry it's a bit different. There is a little bit more freedom actually to make it sound the same in another language, but in prose you can't start retelling, for instance, the original work. I remember one translator once told me that it was so silly in the original that I rewrote it. But actually you can't do it.
Yeah, okay, this makes sense. Yes, go ahead.
An interesting footnote to that is as well that sometimes what do you do as a translator if you find mistakes in the original?
Yeah.
This is an issue for translation studies. And also you said it has to be as close to the original as possible and yet be fluent in the language it's going into. But that's so demanding for the translator, because what if there is a particular use of language that is deliberately somehow exploring, stretching the original?
Sure.
So if translators, poor things, they can do the same thing, but the reading audience might say, well, why is she translating like that? That's not how we use the language.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
Yes, actually, the translators probably have to expand the language more than writers writing in original. Speaking about Estonian, because a writer has a certain vocabulary. In every book he or she writes, they actually don't have to expand it very much. They can just use what they have already. But when a translator has a very demanding original text, he or she has nothing else to do than just find the words in Estonian and, if needed, invent them or make new words or look up remote words. So I think that very good translators actually enrich Estonian language quite a lot.
Okay, what do you do with jokes? What about a joke that's completely untranslatable? Would you try and put in an Estonian joke?
Why is it untranslatable? And I don't understand why a joke would be different to another bit of
You mean wordplays, yes, for instance, and all the puns and these things. Not to replace this Estonian one, but there are some ways actually to get past these problems. For instance, if there is a kind of alliteration or a pun in the original in one place, and the Estonian language just won't let you do something like that in the same place, maybe you can do it on the next page and insert it. I think that the translator of Terry Pratchett had a very difficult time when translating his work into Estonian, but he managed very well, actually. I think that the Estonian versions of Terry Pratchett are very funny and witty and can be read almost the same way as it was in the original.
I had a German translator who translated 6 of my novels, which are just filled with Scottish gags, and he said there's the same number of jokes, just in different places. And the only time he ever actually questioned one, I'd done a really obscure reference to a Proclaimers song, and it was a rude wordplay, and he needed an explanation. So
okay, all right, that's it. Annie, how about for young people consuming literature? Let's say you have, I don't know, any of these books. You can have an English version or an Estonian version. And I think I was still a little bit surprised when some young friends of mine, and they were still going for the Estonian version. I'm like, well, you speak English. Why would you? What are some of the pros and cons of when you've got the same book but 2 copies faced ahead of you?
Yeah, I think that you still sort of feel more comfortable reading in Estonian because it's obviously your native language, and maybe it's like when you read in English, you sort of have to get into the mindset, and you sort of you have to start to think differently. Whilst in if you read in Estonian, you don't have to put much effort into it. And you don't have to look up words, for example. And when you pick a book in English, then it might just be that the first 2 pages are easy to read, but as you get into it, you realize that okay, it's not that easy.
Yeah.
And then, but when you pick a book in Estonian, it's not that likely to happen.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
And in your studies at the English College, we've talked about the great works of the British literature. You said American. Are they introducing some of these other authors? As we've spoken about now, we're getting Indian, we're getting Japanese, we're getting African writers. What other international writers do you look at there?
Well, in British literature, we do take the Commonwealth
Okay,
countries.
yeah.
So we have to make presentations about let's say India or other countries. I don't know if I can bring out any specific authors, but yeah, we have at least 3 weeks or just talking about Commonwealth countries and their literature.
Okay. Pray tell, have you spoken about Australian literature? Oh my God. If such a thing can exist. The only culture in my country comes from the yogurt.
I don't know. No. Sorry.
That's fine. No, I would want to know who it is if that's the case.
And New Zealand as well.
Oh,
is
New
it?
Zealand.
Okay, some of these are. Oh, right.
So can I ask,
Yes.
which sells better? If we can talk about The Boy Wizard, for example, again. Which does the Estonian or English translation sell better in Estonian? Or how does it compare?
The Estonian translation sold better,
By considerably better, or?
considerably better. And I know quite a lot of people who read it in English and Estonian and then started again in English and then again in Estonian.
Sure. I can imagine there would be those people that then would want to read both languages just to get different angles, different elements of the text in both ways. As you say, the ease of understanding your own language, there may be some different viewpoints and depths in the original and then...
Yes, and the translator has looked up all the difficult words.
All right, we've got another question over here. So,
I couldn't resist asking to Miriam. When you're translating a poem, do you often feel that in order to get to the meaning that the poet wanted to bring across, do you ever find researching or trying to find about the life of the poet, what exactly were the conditions or what he was going through his life when he actually wrote this piece? Does any part of your background research or work accord to that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think anyone who's translating from another language, they are connected to the culture in some way. Either they know it well or they live the country or one of the countries that speaks the language. So they're familiar with the culture, the history. They're immersed in that, most likely. Very few people learn a language in isolation from its people. I think one of the nicest comments on this that I have received from poets is that I don't, as the writer, have the last word by any means on this poem. But having said that, yes, I do know the life, the background of the poets. You know the period that they were writing in. Often you can see very specifically what they're responding to. But then again, so very many poems are much more universal. So, yes and no is the answer. And ultimately, it has to be the poem that works with its own linguistic coherence. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
It's okay.
It's a good reply. It's a good reply. We've just gone over an hour, so we're gonna wrap it up soon. Any more questions from the people? Okay, let's see, sir.
Okay. Question to Miriam. I remember I was attending some of your lectures some 9-8 years ago for Irish literature, and I remember you were very passionate about Joyce as the Irish author who became a classic, who's considered a classic because he really explained and opened up the essence of the Irish people. And I wanted to ask, what do you think? Every nation has one. There's Dostoevsky for Russia, there's Tamsara for Estonia, there's Joyce for Ireland, obviously. And do you think there is still room for modern classics to tackle this problem, this question, as the society evolves, as the people evolve, or has everything already been said and told by those heavyweight classics that there is no more room for anything new?
I think there's always room for something new. Joyce was very much a product of his time, his situation, and in his context. And he gave, in a sense, he gave the people of Ireland a bad time. He said, you know, look how awful you are in my nicely polished mirror. Wake up. And his whole history of the difficulty of getting published. So he has written, we're very lucky with Joyce that we have such great correspondence with his publisher when they were resisting and he was censoring, and he said, you will not change a word. Changing a word of my stories hurts them, damages them. So he felt that as the artist in him, he rebelled against that. But he was writing in response to what he saw as a very limited, narrow-minded society. He also felt that was beginning to infect literature, this going back to source and writing only Irish literature for the Irish, the Gaelic, so he said, no, we need to let more air in. So it's just one response to his time. And I think every period in every part of the world is capable of generating writers who respond radically, passionately to their time. I'm not sure if there's anyone who's so strong. I mean, I like what Virginia Woolf said about him at the time. She said he's not a creative genius, he's a brilliant vandal. And I think literature can produce brilliant vandals at any time.
Sure. Okay, very nice. Well, thank you for that. Thank you very much. Yes, sorry? You have a question? Sorry?
Yeah.
Okay.
I hope you didn't already have this question thought up before, but this month we're actually celebrating literature written in English language in Raamat, and we have like 300,000 books which you can order in a week, and as we have talked about literature classics right now, maybe there's some contemporary literature that you have just read or you could recommend to anyone. Maybe either of you, any of you actually could answer this. What would be like current literature that you would recommend right now?
Take a quick run through. Anything? Do you read anything, Douglas? Anything? What do you read? The newspaper?
Well, the main writer I read is Murakami, so I'm reading English translated from the Japanese. So Murakami is available in the shop, so I recommend Haruki Murakami.
Okay, lovely.
Available today, right here.
Krista, do you have some thoughts? Who should Who's an author that someone should be looking at today?
Yes, again, I'm going to mention Kazuo Ishiguro, The Berry Giant, one of the best books I've ever read, actually, and not only recently.
For me, I only ever recommend the thing that I'm reading at the moment because it changes with every one I read.
Yeah.
And I tend to read people whose use of language I love as much as what they're telling. So at the moment, I think I've got Julian Barnes in my bag, writing about Shostakovich. So this is a very nice othering take. He's looking inside the mind of a Soviet-time Russian composer.
Okay.
Fabulous.
Right. Ani, have you read something recently that you thought was interesting? Maybe not for school. What do you read?
I actually just finished The Girl on the Train. So I think last year there was also like a movie about it. So and it was I definitely recommend it. It was full of plot twists, which I think most people love. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that.
Okay, cool. Yes, sir. You have a question.
If we have time, yeah. Last English was Iron Bank civilization. But anyway, the question I wanted to ask, or the thought, is after listening to this workshop, I reminded me that one of the authors you all know is Scott Adams Dilber, where the dogbat human race resource tells to Dilbert that he's starting to teach now everyone English in accent, because people who are speaking with accent consider it to be more smart than English ones. And Dilbert said it's a very good idea, and Dilbert said that now listen, I will tell this same thing with accent. So do you think that the best writers is now coming from different parts of the world, writing in English because tensions, and like, you know, writers are people who are more sensible and maybe sending a message where the tension is. So is it English literature is going out of yeah?
Is English literature going out of fashion? We already briefly talked about it, but out of England, right? So the centres of English literature are no longer in the United Kingdom.
From Africa is coming best English.
Yeah. Right. Right, so I think we already spoke a lot about that, because you've talked about the African guys, these Japanese guys are producing amazing things. So
it's an ongoing dialogue.
Right.
Literature goes out, people write back from whatever their experience on the ground, whether it's sort of places that were part of the British Empire and now they're talking back. Well, in fact, we're already beyond that. We're sort of post beyond the empire.
Sure.
So it's a dialogue. It's an ongoing dialogue. That's what literature is.
Indeed. Okay, so I think yes, please.
I think there is a lot of Englishness still there, and probably in recent years more than ever, because quite a lot of English writers have started to question what does it mean to be English, and they have started to look at the local communities, local history. For instance, Adam Thorpe has written about the location in England going back several centuries. There are authors who deliberately use certain locations in England, certain buildings go back with their history. And I think that some of the British writers have intentionally become more English. And if for several decades probably, some authors have tried to be very British, and now probably it's more fashionable to be English.
All right, good. All right, well, on that note, we are going to wrap up today. Thank you for your questions. Please, let's have a round of applause for our panelists here. Thank you very much for donating your time. We appreciate that.